I called them Governor Trudeau because they should be the 51st state. If they became our 51st state, it'd be the greatest thing they could ever do. I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Hi, I'm Alex Carter. Welcome back to the Government Report. In this installment, we're tackling a subject so fascinating, you'll forget to check your phone for at least 30 seconds. Let's get into it.
Thank you, Alex. The idea of Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States has been debated for years, but only as a thought experiment or political discussion. But now, after Trump's recent interview, this idea has taken a different turn. While the two countries share a long history, deep economic ties, and cultural similarities, such a dramatic change would bring major political, economic, and social consequences. Would Canada's healthcare and social programs survive under U.S. policies? How would the balance of power change in Washington with the addition of 38 million new citizens? What about Canada's vast natural resources? Who would control them? And most importantly, are Canadian people willing for this major shift? These are the questions that need to be addressed even before thinking about such a drastic change in global power. In this installment of the Government Report, we dive into the possible outcomes, the challenges of the trade war with the U.S., and opportunities for Canada to become the 51st U.S. state, Canada's fierce resistance to U.S. trade war. Even before any formal discussions about Canada joining the U.S., tensions between the two nations have flared in recent years, particularly due to economic disputes. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump launched a trade war that severely impacted Canadian industries, sparking backlash from Canadian leaders and citizens alike. Canada's former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was vocal in his condemnation of Trump's aggressive trade policies, labeling them a reckless and damaging move that targeted Canada's economic stability. Likewise, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, just skipped the U.S. entirely for his first official visit, heading straight to Europe instead, signaling another significant shift in the geopolitical power game. When the U.S. imposed tariffs of 25% on Canadian and Mexican goods, along with a 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports, Canada responded forcefully. Ottawa imposed retaliatory tariffs on $107 billion worth of American goods, hitting key U.S. industries hard. Trudeau assured Canadians that their nation would stand strong against economic aggression, firmly rejecting any suggestion that Canada should sacrifice its sovereignty and become the 51st state. Despite Trump's claims that these tariffs were necessary to combat drug smuggling from Canada, Canadian leaders dismissed such accusations as baseless. Meanwhile, the trade dispute fueled a wave of nationalism across Canada, with citizens rallying behind their government's efforts to protect the country's economic interests. Ontario Premier Doug Ford imposed a 25% tax on electricity exports to U.S. states and removed American alcohol from store shelves. Quebec Premier François Legault warned that Trump's policies could put up to 160,000 jobs at risk, while Newfoundland and Labrador removed U.S. products from liquor stores in a show of solidarity. Across Canada, provincial leaders stood united in their opposition to U.S. economic pressure. Although Trudeau emphasized that his primary goal was to resolve the trade dispute peacefully, he made one thing clear: Canada would never surrender its independence. The resistance shown during this trade war raises a critical question. If Canadians are unwilling to tolerate economic aggression from the U.S., would they ever willingly agree to full political integration? Despite political opposition, let's assume that Canada does join the U.S. as the 51st state. What would this mean for both nations? America would become the largest country in the world. If Canada were to join the United States as the 51st state, the most immediate and striking change would be the sheer size of the newly expanded country. Currently, the United States covers about 9.8 million square kilometers, while Canada spans approximately 9.9 million square kilometers. Combining the two would create a nation of nearly 19.8 million square kilometers, surpassing Russia's 17.1 million square kilometers, making the United States the largest country in the world. This change would not only be symbolic, but also carry significant geopolitical and logistical consequences. A country of this size would dominate the North American continent, covering a vast range of climates, landscapes, and ecosystems. From the frozen tundras of the Arctic to the tropical beaches of Florida, the expanded United States would include deserts, plains, mountains, forests, and thousands of lakes and rivers. The Great Lakes, already a vital resource for both countries, would become fully American. The Rocky Mountains, which currently stretch across both nations, would be unified under one government, as would the extensive boreal forests of Canada, some of the most untouched wilderness areas in the world. The challenge of governing such a vast territory would be immense. Managing infrastructure, transportation, and resources across such a large country would require major logistical adjustments. While Canada already has systems in place for maintaining roads, railways, and utilities across its large landmass, merging these with the American infrastructure would require years of integration. Some regions, particularly the northernmost parts of Canada, are sparsely populated and difficult to access, making them less developed in terms of roads and urban centers. Would the U.S. government invest in improving these areas, or would they remain as remote as they are today? Another critical issue would be border security. Canada currently shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. If the two nations merged, traditional border security concerns with Canada would disappear, but new challenges could arise. The Arctic region, which Canada has heavily protected and monitored, would now fall under U.S. control. The United States would suddenly have a much larger northern coastline to defend, requiring expanded military presence and surveillance. The expansion would shift America's focus to new geographical concerns, particularly regarding sovereignty over Arctic waters, which have become more accessible due to climate change. The economic transformation. Canada's economy is highly developed and strong, ranking among the top 10 economies in the world with a GDP of over $2 trillion. If Canada became part of the United States, this massive economy would be absorbed into the American system, making the United States an even greater economic powerhouse. The newly expanded U.S. economy would surpass $30 trillion in GDP, far outpacing China's economy, which currently stands at around $18 trillion. This would solidify the U.S.'s position as the dominant global economic force, with a greater ability to compete in international trade and investments. One of the most significant economic benefits of this integration would be access to Canada's natural resources. Canada is rich in oil, natural gas, minerals, timber, and fresh water. The addition of these resources would provide the United States with even greater energy independence, reducing its reliance on foreign oil imports. Alberta, one of Canada's most resource-rich provinces, has the third largest oil reserves in the world, trailing only Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. If the U.S. gained control of these reserves, it would strengthen its position as a global energy leader. However, this could also create tensions, as many Canadians might resist having their resources controlled by Washington. Despite these benefits, economic integration would not be simple. Canada has a more regulated economy compared to the U.S., with higher corporate taxes, stricter labor laws, and stronger environmental regulations. Canadian businesses might struggle to adapt to the American economic system, which prioritizes free market policies and lower taxation. Would the U.S. government allow Canada to maintain its economic policies, or would it require Canadian businesses to conform to American regulations? Additionally, Canadian workers enjoy strong labor protections, which could clash with American labor laws that differ significantly by state. A major point of contention would be Canada's universal healthcare system. Canada provides free healthcare to all its citizens, funded by taxes, while the U.S. relies on a largely privatized healthcare system with high costs for medical services. If Canada were to become part of the United States, would Americans be willing to adopt a universal healthcare model, or would Canadians be forced to transition to the American system? Many Canadians take great pride in their healthcare system, and any attempt to dismantle it would likely be met with resistance. On the other hand, if the U.S. were to adopt some aspects of Canada's healthcare system, it could spark a major political debate among Americans about the role of government in healthcare, military expansion, and Arctic domination. If Canada joined the United States, one of the most significant changes would be the expansion of the American military. Currently, Canada has a relatively small but well-trained military force. with around 100,000 active and reserve personnel. Its military assets include fighter jets, submarines, frigates, and helicopters. While Canada's military is not as large as the United States, it plays an important role in NATO and peacekeeping missions worldwide. By absorbing Canada's military forces, the United States would gain additional manpower and equipment, further strengthening its position as the world's most powerful military force. More importantly, the U.S. would gain complete control over the Arctic region, an area of increasing geopolitical importance. As climate change continues to melt Arctic ice, new shipping routes are opening up, and valuable resources such as oil and minerals are becoming more accessible. Canada currently claims sovereignty over much of the Arctic, and if it became part of the U.S., these claims would transfer to Washington. However, many Canadians take pride in their military's independent role in global peacekeeping and disaster relief. Canada's military has historically been more focused on defense and humanitarian missions rather than offensive operations. If Canada became part of the U.S., its military forces would likely be expected to participate in American-led military interventions, something many Canadians might strongly oppose. The question arises, would Canadian soldiers be willing to fight in wars that they might not support, particularly those that align more with U.S. foreign policy, rather than Canada's traditional stance of diplomacy and peacekeeping? Another key issue would be military bases and nuclear weapons. The United States has military bases around the world and maintains a significant nuclear arsenal. Canada, however, does not host American nuclear weapons on its soil. If Canada became part of the U.S., would it be required to allow nuclear weapons within its borders? Would Canadian cities become strategic military targets in the event of a global conflict? These questions would raise significant concerns among Canadians, who generally favor a more neutral approach to global conflicts. Control over vast natural resources. Canada is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, and if it became part of the United States, control over these resources would shift to Washington. Canada has the world's largest reserves of freshwater, holding nearly 20% of the planet's freshwater supply. This would be a significant asset for the U.S., particularly as freshwater shortages become a growing global concern. In addition to water, Canada possesses vast reserves of oil, natural gas, uranium, timber, and minerals. The country is also one of the world's top producers of hydroelectric power, which could further contribute to America's energy independence. One of the biggest challenges in this scenario would be how these resources are managed. Many Canadian provinces, such as Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec, have strong regional control over their resources. If the U.S. took control, it could lead to conflicts over environmental policies and resource extraction. Would the U.S. government prioritize economic development over environmental protection? Would Indigenous communities who have significant land rights in Canada be willing to accept U.S. policies that could disrupt their way of life? Another concern would be the potential exploitation of Canada's Arctic resources. The Arctic contains vast deposits of oil, gas, and minerals that have yet to be fully explored. Currently, Canada enforces strict environmental protections in the Arctic. But if the U.S. took control, these policies might change. Would the U.S. push for more aggressive resource extraction in the Arctic, despite the environmental risks? This could lead to significant disputes between environmental activists and those advocating for economic development. If Canada became part of the United States, these economic and environmental questions would be at the center of debates over the future direction of the country. The integration of Canada's resources into the U.S. economy would bring enormous benefits, but it would also come with major challenges related to governance, regional autonomy, and sustainability. Would Canadians ever accept this? Despite the potential economic and military benefits, one major obstacle remains. Would Canadians ever agree to become the 51st state? The answer, based on history and current sentiment, would be a resounding, "No way, hoser." Canada takes great pride in its national identity, distinct from the U.S. The country's healthcare system, social policies, and political landscape differ significantly from its southern neighbor. The resistance to U.S. economic pressure as seen in the recent trade war, is a clear indication that Canadians value their independence. Even if political leaders were to entertain the idea, a referendum would almost certainly result in a resounding rejection. So, what do you think? Would Canada ever willingly give up its independence to become the 51st state? Would the cultural and political differences be too great to overcome? Or is the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state a science fiction fantasy for some politician? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let Alex know what you think. Back to you, Alex.
That's it for this installment of the Government Report. If you made it this far, congratulations. You now know things you probably weren't supposed to. I'm Alex Carter, and I'll see you in the new installment of the Government Report.